Before there was Tellico Lake, or Tellico Village, or Rarity Bay, Wind River, or Thunder Point. Before the industrial parks in Von Orr, or the many marinas to serve the boaters who enjoy water skiing, fishing, and cruising on the lake. Before all of this, there was a river, the Little Tennessee River, or the Little T as it is known locally. Hello, I'm Gary Mulliner with Tellico Village Broadcasting, here to share the fascinating history of the Tellico Dam. Today I'm on the banks of the Tellico River. Before the dam was completed, the Little T looked a lot like this. It has been home to a myriad of Native Americans, with the Cherokee being the last to reside along its banks. Later, anglers from near and far would know the Little T as one of the best fly fishing rivers in the country, and they could count on an abundance of trout from her pristine waters. Along richly fertile banks of the Little Tennessee, hundreds of family farms dotted the landscape. During the 1920s, change began in the Smoky Mountains when Alcoa Aluminum was established just south of Knoxville. Cheap electricity, so critical for the production of aluminum, led Alcoa to build both the Santilla and Calderwood hydroelectric dams high in the mountains to power their factories. With the economic crash of 1929, the election of Franklin Roosevelt, the start of World War II, and the needs of the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, more power was critical for the eastern half of the nation. Under the New Deal legislation, a new and dynamic government agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was created to bring East Tennessee into the 20th century. Before the frenzy ended, TVA had created more than 30 dams in the Tennessee River Valley. As the TVA began to look for ways to reboot its waning pizzazz, Chairman Aubrey Red Wagner decided to pursue the Tellico Project.
With no shortage of books written on the subject, we have found this one, TVA and the Tellico Dam, written by Bruce Wheeler and Michael J. McDonald, to be a pretty fair representation of the many perspectives of the project. Wheeler and McDonald set the stage in Chapter 1 as TVA was searching for a new mission. When TVA Chairman Red Wagner called a meeting at Watts Bar in February of 1959, he was preparing to launch TVA on a new mission, shifting from hydroelectric power to economic development. Years of internal and external conflict had forced TVA into the narrow mission of power, navigation, and flood control. But changing times had forced the agency to reassess its role in the Tennessee Valley. It had concluded that only a series of multi-purpose projects would bring the desired results of industrialization, recreation, tourism, and jobs, and those multi-purpose projects would have to come on the tributaries. As we will soon see, the Little Tennessee River became the first of those tributaries.
The year was 1967, and the TVA had already constructed a series of hydroelectric dams. Now they set their sights on the Little Tennessee River. They began construction on a dam that would flood the area, creating the Tellico Reservoir. It would soon be a beautiful recreational lake with miles of shoreline for lakefront homes, manufacturing, and commercial endeavors. The TVA was convinced that the Tellico Dam would bring much-needed economic development to the area. This was especially needed in the severely economically depressed counties of Monroe, Loudoun, and Blount.
To many within TVA, Tellico was much more than a dam, and considerably more was at stake than its mere completion. In short, it was to be the showcase of the new mission.
It is important to note that in the early 1940s, local farmers became aware of the markers that TVA surveyors had placed in their fields, indicating where the high water mark would be. This includes markers along the Little Tennessee and Tellico valleys. These discoveries were made more than 25 years before the project was brought to fruition. I believe that these markers and the news of possible impending dams may have retarded growth in many areas, as most locals were not really sure what their future might hold. The Tellico Dam was built between 1967 and 1979 with the stated purposes of hydroelectric power, commercial and residential shoreline development, flood control, and recreational areas. But not everyone was in favor of building the Tellico Dam. Remember those hundreds of farms along the banks of the river? They would need to be impounded, some of the result of eminent domain, and acres of land then flooded to become part of the lake. Many of these farms had been in families for generations, and their livelihood depended on the rich, fertile soil of East Tennessee. What would become of the farmers, the fishermen, and the wildlife that made the Little Tennessee their home? These were important questions that demanded answers, and the future of the entire area depended upon what would happen next.
While opponents of the dam were considering their less than attractive options, a new figure appeared on the battlefield, a person who would galvanize the opposition with the force of his personality, his intelligence, and his near obsession with bringing the Tellico project to a stop. In fall 1973, Zygmunt, known as Zig, Plotter, arrived in Knoxville to take up his duties as assistant professor at the UT College of Law. Almost as soon as he arrived in East Tennessee, he became caught up in the Tellico controversy.
It's a notorious piece of history that I was privileged or cursed to be part of.
And notorious is an accurate description. While TVA was at work building their economic development justification for the dam, landowners in jeopardy of losing their property were making the case against it. I asked Zig, who was the driving force in favor of the dam?
I think the main person was Red Wagner. He was the chairman of TVA, and he was an absolute monarch of this region. He was more powerful than any of the governors. When Governor Winfield Dunn begged him to develop the river with the farmers still there, with the history, with the archaeology, Red Wagner told the governor of Tennessee, "You don't know your own state as well as I do." Do you know why the dam was justified? Number one, recreation. By eliminating the last big free-flowing river in the Tennessee River system, attracting people from all over, you would increase recreation by creating just one more lake. And the second was shoreline development, reselling the land that had been condemned from the farmers.
In TVA's economic development plan to justify the dam was the creation of a city called Timberlake. The goal was to create 25,000 jobs, resulting in a city with a population of about 50,000. The key employer was expected to be the Boeing Company, an American corporation that designs, manufactures, and sells aircraft. However, before the dam was completed, Boeing decided against building a facility in the area. TVA then negotiated with General Electric, but ultimately, neither company came. In the end, Timberlake would never materialize the way TVA had planned. For this reason, Zig came to call it the hypothetical, or sometimes the pretend city.
Almost immediately after President Lyndon Johnson's 1967 budget appeared, TVA's economists urged the general manager to act on the Timberlake project as quickly as possible. Apparently, it had been decided that TVA would build the model city in cooperation with a private developer. However, no industries had yet been attracted, and there were some people, albeit mainly opponents of the Tellico project, who doubted if they ever would be.
Red Wagner's people said, okay, we'll take that idea and we'll have a hypothetical city. Timberlake was separate from Tellico Dam, but Timberlake was essential to trying to convince the people in Washington that there was a positive benefit-cost ratio to spend this money when it wasn't for power, it wasn't for flood control, it wasn't for water supply. TVA had made its reputation on bringing power to this region. And obviously, the dams were part of that, but it had switched over to nuclear and coal. But still, the legend of TVA, the reputation of TVA, was built of the image of water spewing from the dams of the Tennessee River. So part of it was maintaining the legend. The more you get into it, the more you see people who knew about it were desperate to stop the dam, but most people never heard the story. This river was beloved by people throughout this area, not just for fishing, but many of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts had grown up with canoe trips down the river. They would stop on one of the islands for a picnic and go on. The Cherokee obviously were deeply concerned. So the Cherokee in North Carolina, who remained after Andrew Jackson and Monroe had kicked them out, still came to gather medicine on the banks of the Little T. In the 1970s, there were fishermen who came from 6 states to fish the Little T. I've met people in Maine who had traveled to the Little T to fish. The trout fishing was extraordinary, and the history was known around the nation. So there were people all over the place, but the local 300 families were dispossessed because TVA wasn't just condemning the area for the reservoir. To justify this pretend city, they had to take 38,000 acres. 300 families lost their farms so that Red Wagner could say that there was a pretend city that was going to be built to justify his dam.
Zig told us about an alternate economic development proposal. Instead of creating a lake on the city of Timberlake, it would utilize the Little Tennessee River and tourism on the Cherokee Trail.
Well, that really should have been the key for local discussion. TVA said it's the dam and their hypothetical city or nothing. And if you care about economic development, you'll do it the way I want. But if we had been able to get the media and politics to focus on the river development model, like the White River in Arkansas, tourists coming up I-75 or coming east or west on I-40 would have gotten to the Cherokee Trail, which we could have done at first just with highway signs, coming up 444 as it is now to 72 and along the river. There were 14 tourism sites. Fort Loudon obviously one of them, but the farmers were happy to have people come in to special places and fishing and canoeing and then across a bridge up to the Foothills Parkway and into the national park. That alternative development, agriculture, industrial park, residential, but tourism would have been extraordinary. But I failed in getting the economic analysis finished for the tourism, so it was never considered. But the plan was there.
As TVA continued with their plans for the Tellico Dam, 300 families along the Little Tennessee River braced for losing their farms, many which had been in their families for generations. But some were determined not to leave without a fight. Zig introduced us to 2 of them, Alfred Davis and Carolyn Ritchie. Let us begin with our guests telling us where they were at the time when this all began, late 1960s, early 1970s, and when they first heard about TVA was serious about confiscating their properties.
I was born and raised in Loudoun County, just up the river from Davis Ferry. Our farm there didn't go to the river. There was one farm between us and the river. TVA was only gonna cover with water maybe an acre. And what they took was 60 acres, half of the farm. My father was raised in the Morganton, in the Wire Bend, right up from Morganton Ferry. His great-grandfather had bought 360 acres in there around 1840.
Okay.
And my grandfather had 120 and he left it to his only son, only child, my father. We had that farm too. Now, there they took the whole bend of the river. At our home place where I was raised, they only took 60 acres, which they developed into housing.
So where was your property?
It was 119 acres in the area in the Jackson community near Jackson Bend on the river, the Little Tennessee River, and we were on a plateau about a half a mile up. And Fork Creek, which was the eastern border for our property, curved around, and there was a slight bluff, and they only the water would be over maybe 2.5, 3 acres at the most along that bluff, which Daddy didn't let the cows go to the creek anyway. Okay. So that was just land he didn't use.
How long had your family owned that property?
So in 1950, Daddy bought the farm, Daddy and Mama, December, and then they moved in 51. But ironically, this farm where Daddy moved was just about you could go up the slight field and you look over, and over on the next ridge is where Daddy grew up. So around the Jackson community in Loudoun County where I grew up, it was a farming community. That was what everybody would talk about at church. Did you read what was in the paper? They're saying the dam's coming. Then in 1961, the Knoxville News Sentinel had as their headline, Tellico Dam, I'm not sure the exact wording of the title, back in the works. And then it would be at the co-op when Daddy would go. That would be the talk. So at supper time from 1961, when I was in the first grade, all the way through 66 when they got their funding, it was passed back and forth between this congressional committee to that one trying to get the funding. And so that was all that you heard. That it was in the background. You lived your lives, you made your gains in your family with their steps, people graduating from college, they getting jobs, having their businesses. But that was always back there like a phantom.
What kind of action did your families, either you or your parents, begin to do to resist or fight or try to save your properties? Albert?
Actually, nothing. Back then, Tellico Dam had been a threat for years.
It was a threat which had been going on so long that people didn't really think it was really ever going to happen. It was just going to continue to be this threat.
It was a threat.
So at what point then, Carolyn, did you begin to look for ways to save the property?
I think it was in the early 60s, soon after it came into the public eye again. There were groups that formed quickly after that. And there was a group that met on Rose Island, sort of privately, and they formed and then got their committee together of how they were going to fight. And then they would invite others, and things traveled up and down the river from, just mouth to mouth, and they would inform people of what the TVA was doing. There were, they had an inner workings among them that they tried to find out from the media what was going on from Washington, and they tried to keep the farmers filled in.
Who in the community supported your efforts, and who opposed it? I mean, that you could consciously see or hear?
We really never had anybody object to our efforts. Now, I'll tell you what happened in our case. Most people never fought until it got right down to them. When TVA come and said, this is what they're going to give you, then that's when you go to fight. One thing that TVA did, they divided and conquered. They would go over here and buy a farm, then they'd go over yonder and buy a farm. They didn't just start in one place and buy everybody out.
No. And they approached the sick and elderly first.
And I'm sure they studied the economics of that particular farm. If somebody owed a lot of money, maybe, they used tactics that you would think they wouldn't do. It's our government. It's the greatest government in the world. Your government wouldn't do you dirty, but they did.
Okay.
Landowners, even some who had bitterly opposed the project, began selling out as TVA appraisers and land purchase officers moved slowly through the valley. Only a few openly resisted.
And the other terrible thing for the landowner, if a landowner went to the local lawyer, guess what he told him? Well, it's awful, this is bad, but this is the federal government. You can't win with the federal government.
Okay.
The landowner was discouraged everywhere he went.
What about local government?
TVA went to the political heads of Monroe, Loudon, and Blount, and they fed them hook, line, and sinker with the amount of funding they were going to funnel into their little government. And so they had them in their pocket at the get-go.
From the beginning.
Prosperity was just going to overflow everywhere.
Even while farmers were focused on the loss of their land, and understandably so, there's another side to the story. One that was filled with the promise of a better life for those in economically depressed counties of Monroe, Loudon, and Blount. Charles Wagner, who as a young attorney served as a senior litigator for TVA during the tumultuous years of the Tellico Dam project, shares a different perspective. Let's shift a little bit here and look at TVA from the top. Aubrey Red Wagner, who was the chairman of the board, was the one, it appears, wanted the Tellico Dam project to continue TVA's growth, TVA's position as a provider of power, flood control, etc. What was your personal and professional relationship with Mr. Wagner?
I had no personal relationship. His name is the same as mine. He is no kin to me whatsoever. I certainly had a professional relationship with him. My opinion of Mr. Wagner is very simple. He loved the TVA. He loved the community. He loved the valley that TVA served, and he was dedicated for TVA to adhere to their mission of flood control, resource development, power generation, and to do everything he could for the people of this area. The decision to build the Tellico Dam occurred way before I got to TVA.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
So I was not involved in all that. You know, my involvement in it came after it was probably 75 or 80% complete. I think there's a legitimate argument. Which one would you rather have? A developed reservoir that is beautiful like it is today with 10,000 home sites, a tax base, economic development that benefits a 3-county area, or is it better as a river bottom place? I think you'll find a legitimate difference of opinion about that. But I think Mr. Wagner, based on my knowledge of him, had a sincere belief that Monroe Countyans, Loudon Countyans were entitled to more. TVA's mission and part of their mission of economic development was to benefit those 2 counties and to make them far more desirable and the tax base greater and the opportunities in those counties far better. My impression had always been that the public was way in favor of the Tellico project, that there were a group of environmentalists and others and landowners that didn't want their land taken, that opposed the project.
In short, while some landowners held out, among the farmers whose land was to be taken, significant opposition virtually collapsed. Indeed, subsequent public opinion polls of local landowners consistently showed that a high percentage favored the project.
One of the more controversial parts of this saga was the process of eminent domain that TVA used to obtain land for this reservoir. Charles explains the process.
Sometime that TVA would be able to buy the land and there would be no issue at all. Normally that happened. But occasionally the landowner and TVA would be in disagreement, and that required some type of a resolution process. When the TVA had a public use for a piece of property, when an agreement cannot be reached, the government has the right of eminent domain. And the condemnation process is the process where the government takes private property, for public use and fair compensation is arrived in some type of agreed process.
And what generally is that process for coming up with a fair price for the person?
That's a very interesting question, particularly as it relates to TVA. I do want to say that from TVA's standpoint, when I came with TVA really tried hard not to have disagreements. TVA would have 3 appraisals. They would take the highest appraisal, and generally that appraisal was determined to be about 10% or more higher than fair market value. So TVA bent over backwards to pay people fairly.
Many sold willingly, amazed at the prices TVA offered for farms that had been owned by families for generations. Those few with heavy mortgages, usually contracted with local banks to buy equipment or make improvements, saw a quick and easy way out of their financial problems.
I do want to say that taking property for public use is a very sensitive matter.
Absolutely.
And in this project, it was even more sensitive. TVA at that time really strongly advocated that if we're gonna do this and we're gonna spend the money to do this, we need to offer these communities a really tremendous opportunity for development. There were people that were very, very angry about their property being taken, and the Tellico Resources Development Agency, or TVA, or the public generally, getting the benefit of the increased value of their property as a result of the impoundment.
Right.
They were very, very upset about that. And those are the primary people that I always saw as being opposed to the project. Would I see what has happened to this county, to these 2 counties, largely attributable to Tellico, that people have come in from all over the United States and found a home here, that this tax base has made life in this area so much better for those other people? I would personally think that it's better than Red Wagner would have thought, and that as he looks down right now, that he would be very proud of what's happened at the Tellico project.
Super. While we know that the Tellico Dam was eventually completed and the reservoir formed, it's clear from hearing these different perspectives of the project, the path to completion was not without roadblocks. There are many twists and turns on the way, along with a few surprises.
Until this little fish came into the picture, there was no way in American law or government to make the argument that the farmers were making on economics in any practical, political, or legal way.
Be sure to tune in for the next episode of What's the Story to learn how a little fish almost killed the Tellico Dam.